Of the dark and twisted minds we've covered on this channel, today's story is perhaps one of the most chillingly calculated. You're going to hear about a man whose high intellect was completely detached from his emotional core, leading him to commit acts of unthinkable, repetitive violence. By the end, you'll be forced to question how a profound lack of emotional connection can transform early childhood trauma into a monstrous, controlled existence. What is the fundamental difference between a person who fantasizes about control and the person who acts on those fantasies? Today, we're not just reviewing the facts of the Edmund Kemper case. We're answering the core question: was he driven by psychotic delusions or by a cold, calculating, psychopathic need for dominance? Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I talk about the psychology behind the crimes. Today, we're analyzing a case that's highly intriguing, deeply complex, and a horrifying look at the long-term impact of severe psychological abuse. Without further ado, let's pull back the curtains and unravel this case together. This is the story of Edmund Kemper. What happens when a child already struggling with his identity is treated not as a son, but by a tormentor, by the one person meant to nurture him? We have to understand the environment that created the psychological precursor for later violence. Edmund Kemper was born in 1948 in Burbank, California, a large child with an IQ of 145, a stunning score that placed him in the genius range. But his home life was anything but nurturing, dominated by the constant conflict between his parents and the profound psychological cruelty of his mother. Clarnell was a deeply disturbed woman who openly rejected her son, locking him in the basement, often for days at a time, because she was physically repulsed by his size and mannerisms. She made him sleep in a closet, a literal physical rejection that instilled an extreme, early-stage sense of abandonment and worthlessness. When Kemper was 10, his parents divorced, and he and his sisters moved with their mom to Montana. His psychological wounds were exacerbated by his mom's controlling and emasculating behavior. She constantly told him he would end up in a mental hospital or prison. This wasn't just verbal abuse. It was a full form of coercive control where the dominant parent actively shapes the child's identity around feelings of shame and failure. The result of this constant shame was a developing personality structure built on splitting. He began to see the world in rigid black and white. His mother was purely evil and suffocating. Young women were either idealized or pure, or they were objects of his internalized rage. His earliest known disturbing behavior points directly towards a search for control and inability to process complex emotions. He tortured and killed the family cat, and later killed his younger sister's puppy. And by the time he was 13, he was sent back to California to live with his paternal grandparents, Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr., in the quiet city of North Fork. Why was he sent away? Because his mom discovered the animal killings and used them as proof that her son was the monster she always said he was. This act of being rejected and shuffled off further reinforced the psychological belief that if he was going to be labeled a monster, he might as well fulfill the prophecy. North Fork seemed like a place for a fresh start, a safe, quiet community far from its mother's psychological warfare. But the psychological damage was already complete, and the quiet environment offered no real structure or escape from his own mind. On August 20th, 1964, at the age of 15, Kemper was home alone with his grandmother Maud Kemper. He grabbed a .22 caliber rifle, went outside, and shot her in the head as she tended to a garden. Why did he choose his grandmother first, when his rage was directed at his mother? The answer lies in the psychological link between the two. He stated that his grandmother reminded him of his mother's oppressive ways. He then went to wait for his grandfather, Edmund Sr., to return home from the grocery store. When his grandfather arrived, Kemper shot him as well, ensuring his control over the entire situation. He called his mother in Montana to tell her what he had done, and she immediately arranged for him to surrender. The act of killing was a desperate, maladaptive attempt to seize control over his environment and silence the internalized, critical voice of his mother. Following the murder of his grandparents, Kemper was institutionalized at the state hospital. He was initially diagnosed with paranoia schizophrenia, a common but inaccurate diagnosis for individuals exhibiting bizarre and severe violence. The reality of his psychological makeup was far more insidious, and his time in the institution became a masterclass in manipulation. Kemper's high IQ made him an exceptional observer. He quickly learned the clinical language of psychiatry and what doctors wanted to hear. He became the perfect patient, pretending remorse and stability while using the time to carefully study the behavioral patterns of the staff and other patients. He essentially psychoanalyzed the analyst, a classic demonstration of narcissistic grandiosity, paired with a psychopathic lack of conscience. The crucial clue here is that he wasn't healing. He was refining his ability to deceive and gain access to freedom. After 5 years and at the age of 21, a petition for his release was made, arguing that he was no longer a threat. His own mother fought against his release, but incredibly, Kemper's pleas for freedom and his seemingly positive psychological evaluations were successful. In 1969, Kemper was released and was forced to return to his mother's home in Santa Cruz, California. But why would a man who killed his grandparents to gain control return to the ultimate source of his rage? The answer is terrifying. The goal was no longer freedom from his mother. His return to her oppressive environment created a psychological pressure cooker, and he began to experience intensely violent sexual fantasies aimed at young women. He even worked briefly for the California Department of Transportation and tried to join the police force, a common move among those seeking to legitimize their need for ultimate authority. He spent his time between 1970 and 1972 meticulously planning and scouting locations. This planning shows incredible impulse control, which is usually absent in those suffering from active schizophrenia or acute psychosis. Kemper's victims were exclusively young female university students, or Co-Eds, who were hitchhiking in the Santa Cruz area. His pattern was clear. He would use his size, charm, and seemingly harmless demeanor to lure them into his vehicle. The series of murders began in May 1972. His first victims were 18-year-old Mary and 19-year-old Anita. He dismembered their bodies and disposed of them along the side of the road and in the mountains. Over the next few months, Kemper escalated his behavior, each crime a deeper dive into the abyss of his compulsions. In January 1973, he picked up 2 more students. The motive was not simply gratification. It was about possession and control that extended beyond death. The post-mortem acts, which included dismemberment, were a symbolic dismantling of the female figure who had tormented him his entire life. The case became a massive police effort in Santa Cruz, a community gripped by panic over the missing students. Kemper had a peculiar relationship with the Santa Cruz Police Department, a relationship that reveals his deep antisocial tendencies. He would often frequent a bar called the Veterans Hall, where he would drink with police officers, even discussing the Co-Ed killer case with them. He would talk about the profile of the killer, giving them vague yet accurate details, essentially playing a psychological game of cat and mouse. This calculated proximity to the law enforcement investigating his own crimes is a textbook example of grandiosity and risk-taking. He felt intellectually superior to the investigators, deriving a profound narcissistic thrill knowing that he was sitting right next to the men trying to catch him. The psychological clues were everywhere, but police were looking for a frantic, chaotic killer, not a smooth-talking genius who was openly engaging with them. In February 1973, he murdered 2 friends, 18-year-old Cindy and 19-year-old Rosalinda. The constant repeated pattern demonstrates a psychological compulsion that had fully taken over. Each murder was a rehearsal for the final, ultimate act of psychological closure he had been building toward since his childhood. On April 20th, 1973, Kemper finally carried out the murder that all previous acts had been building toward, the murder of his mother. He bludgeoned her to death with a hammer as she slept. The brutality and intimacy of the act were the ultimate rejection of the woman had rejected him his entire life. But the psychological need for control didn't end there. He also murdered his mom's friend Sally, who was staying with them, immediately eliminating any witness to his final, most significant crime. After their murders, Kemper calmly drove across the country, finally calling the police from a phone booth in Colorado, where he confessed to everything. This final act of confession wasn't remorse. It was a final controlling act of the crime he was ending on his own terms. The ultimate aha moment is that the murders of the Co-Eds were a form of psychological displacement. These young, intelligent, successful women were everything his mom valued and everything Kemper felt his mother denied him. Killing them was a symbolic act of rage against his mother's perceived ideals, which eventually brought him full circle to the actual target. We have all the facts of this case. Now let's put on the clinical lens and analyze the twisted genius mind of Edmund Kemper. But before we dive into the clinical specifics, if you find this level of psychological analysis helpful, please take a second and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, let's look at the pathology. Kemper's early diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was likely incorrect, based on a limited understanding of psychopathy and trauma response. The central issue is the degree of organization and control in his crimes. Schizophrenia is characterized by a significant break from reality, resulting in disorganized thoughts and speech and chaotic behavior. Kemper, however, exhibited years of meticulous planning, complex deception, and impulse control until the final act, and profound self-awareness, which are not typical of acute psychosis. My clinical speculation based on recorded behaviors and life history points to a diagnosis involving the antisocial personality disorder spectrum. Psychopathy is a severe personality disorder characterized by four main factors, and Kemper hits them all. The first factor is interpersonal, superficial charm and manipulative nature and grandiosity. The second factor is affective, a lack of remorse and emotional shallowness, and a lack of empathy. The third is a lifestyle factor. It's impulsive behaviors, parasitic existence, and extreme irresponsibility. And the fourth, antisocial factor, criminal versatility and early behavioral problems. His entire life trajectory was defined by an extreme case of narcissism. It explained his need for complete ownership and dominance over his victims, an attempt to restore the sense of power that his mother systematically stolen from him. The fact that he confessed, knowing he would be caught, also speaks to this narcissistic profile. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was demanding that the world finally pay attention to his brilliant, powerful monster that his mother had created. The sexual component of his crimes, including necrophilia and mutilation, strongly indicates sexual sadism. This is a paraphilia where the gratification is derived from inflicting physical or psychological suffering on another person. In Kemper's case, the sexual violence was linked to the deep-seated psychological wound, the hatred of the female image as embodied by his mother. The violation and the dismantling of the bodies were a symbolic undoing of his mother's control over him, an attempt to destroy the source of his trauma through proxies. His acts were not random. They were highly ritualized and specifically chosen to satisfy a psychological deficit that had been festering since childhood. Now, let's look at the psychological impact on the victims and why they were tragically vulnerable to Kemper's manipulation. The area of Santa Cruz in the early 1970s was a hotbed of counterculture, where hitchhiking was common and trust in strangers was relatively high. Kemper expertly exploited this cultural openness. His victims, often young and independent, were perhaps displaying the kind of carefree attitude that his mom would have criticized. They were vulnerable, not because of any inherent flaw, but because Kemper's presentation was the antithesis of a predator. He was large, yes, but he was articulate, intelligent, and presented himself as kind, helpful, and lonely, a master of deception. This psychological angle shows us how even in the absence of a visible threat, a highly intelligent predator can use empathy and trust as weapons. Following his confession, Edmund Kemper was found guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder in 1973. Due to the previous diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in California law at the time, his lawyers argued for the death penalty to be waived, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. As of today, Kemper currently resides at the medical facility in California, a prison that specializes in treating inmates with mental health issues, where he's been for decades. The legacy of the victims, Mary, Anita, Aiko, Laura, Cindy, and Rosalinda, is that they were young women with boundless potential, tragically taken by a man who could not reconcile his own trauma. Their families faced agonizing wait for justice, and for many, the psychological impact of having their loved ones vanish into thin air caused a trauma that lasts a lifetime. The resolution in this case isn't happiness or closure, but the cold, hard fact that the community recovered and continues to honor the memory of those lost. The ultimate lesson from the Kemper case, seen through a clinical lens, is that the deepest psychological wounds, when left untreated and unacknowledged, can seek out the most violent and controlling forms of expression. It reminds us that the greatest dangers often hide not in visible chaos, but behind the mask of deception, intelligence, and manufactured calm. What did you think about this case? If the psychology of the high IQ psychopaths like Kemper intrigues you, you'll want to take a look at our next video breaking down the clinical profile of yet another serial killer who used superior intellect to manipulate and control. Take a look at this next video. Thank you for joining me today, and until next time, stay curious, stay safe.